Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
Welcome to Rivers of Living Water, a program offered by Mary Schwartz about how to grow in holiness and have an intimate relationship, or more intimate relationship with God. Jesus said in John chapter 7, "If anyone thirst, let him come to me and drink, and out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." And now, here's Mary Schwartz.
One of the ways Jesus fulfills his promise to give us living water is through the gift of contemplative prayer. The Church says contemplative prayer is not just for the great saints, but a gift God wants to give to all of us. We'll be talking about the virtues we need to grow in and how to pray so that we have a more intimate relationship with God and obtain this gift of contemplative prayer, this living water, which transforms us more and more into the likeness of Christ. Our guest today is Dr. Ronda Chervin. Dr. Ronda is one of the most popular Catholic speakers and writers today. A retired philosophy professor, she's the author of 50 books about the faith. You can get them at rondachervin.com. Today we are going to continue our discussion of Dr. Ronda's book, Avoiding Bitterness and Suffering, about how the saints found peace in the midst of suffering. And our topic today is how the saints found peace in the suffering of exploitation. Dr. Ronda, you say that a great many women today who have to work outside the home and then come back and do the bulk of the housework and child raising themselves are feeling exploited.
Yes, well, actually, I want to nuance that a bit. You know, I've been observing this for a long time because it happened in my own life that when I got married, my husband was a very successful businessman. He was a book sales manager for Thomas Nelson for their books that were not the religious books, the other books that they published. And he was earning a great salary, and when I got pregnant and had twins, I assumed I would be home taking care of the kids and he would be working as usual. But he got devastating late onset asthma. And by the time my twins were 5 years old, he really couldn't work anymore. And since I had gotten a PhD in philosophy, I started working full-time teaching philosophy, and he went on disability. And the difficulty was this: even though he lived another 20 years on heavy cortisone and things like that, and he was up during the night, wheezing and suffering, and I was up too, trying to figure out each night, should we go to the hospital, you know, and then meanwhile I was bringing up the kids and I was working full-time. Now, full-time teaching in the university is very different than 9 to 5 and commute, because you have a certain number of classes, but you have a lot of flexibility in timing and so forth. So I would get up about 7 in the morning. Then the school happened to be right across the street, so then I'd go to daily mass, which has always been my practice, and then I'd teach a few classes. I'd teach 4 classes, but that was like 2 hours each day, office hours, etc. I'd be home before the kids came home, and so forth, and then I'd take care of them, do housework, etc., etc. Then in the evenings, meanwhile, he became a writer, which was what he always wanted to do, not to be a salesman, but to be a writer. So he would write in the morning, and then he'd go and he liked to just walk around. This is L.A., Los Angeles, and so forth. And then in the evening, we would listen to music together. He would he would watch TV, and I would sit and mark papers watching TV. Now, the thing was, he would spend a lot of time talking to the kids, which was terrific, and he would take care of all the outside things, like shopping or buying cars or getting insurance or things like that, which he was very good at. But otherwise, all the housework fell to me, partly because he was brought up in a little town just like Fiddler on the Roof. His parents were like from Fiddler on the Roof in Europe. But in that Jewish culture, men never went into the kitchen at all. And they didn't do housework because they were out in the field, okay, or running the business, the family business. So I had the feeling, that if I would insist that he help with the housework, he would feel sort of castrated in a certain way, to say. So I didn't insist, besides which he was 20 years older than me, so I was like a daughter figure. I wasn't an equal figure to begin with. So I didn't feel as if I should just insist that he help me. But then, just the same, I blamed him constantly that I was exhausted and had too much to do and he wouldn't help. See? So, I think many situations, another example that I see very often among some women, the husband wants the wife to work because they want to have a good income. So the double income is worth it. So, so then she has a much higher standard usually than he of housekeeping. So he would say, he would want to do, let's do once a week, let's clean the house. But she wants it always spick and span at the end of each day. And then she doles out all the tasks to him and the family. And so he can wind up feeling, his whole day is like, he commutes to his job. He works at the job, which maybe he doesn't like. He comes home, and right after dinner, he's busy helping make the house beautiful.
Right.
And he's exhausted. He could feel exploited. So she's feeling if they're both going to work, they ought to help equally with the kids and the housework. But meanwhile, her standard is much higher.
Yes. Or possibly too high for the situation.
Yeah. So even though I say this in my book about men and women both feeling exploited, there are many nuances to this in the sense that you see in these kind of ways.
Of course. Although, right, and we're not radical feminists on the show, but it's true, I think, that it does happen that women end up with a larger share of these things. But, of course, there are many kinds of exploitation today, aren't there? First of all, it's open to question whether or not any given situation is exploitation. We're not saying all women are being exploited by any means. But for instance, so many people have to work for very low wages today, don't they?
Yes, and it's a very complicated situation with that. So certainly, many men will work at a job with back and forth. It's a 3-hour commute, particularly in the Los Angeles area. Why? Because they don't want to live in a dangerous area where their kids are going to be into gangs and stuff like that. So they move out to the suburbs. They have this long commute, and they're meanwhile working for a very low salary because the companies they're working for downsize and they're doing the same job. They're doing like time and a half but no overtime. And that's a sort of form of exploitation. But then it's very, and then, of course, now we're talking about middle-class America because that's what we're in the United States. There are certainly countries where there is really slave labor.
Yes.
So that's
Rhonda, that's right. Well, how do you define exploitation? In your book,
I would define it as work unjustly allocated, underpaid, received with ingratitude.
Right.
I used to say when women first started going out to work, or very often contracepting, having only 1 or 2 kids, go back to work, that they would never have done this if the husband and the kids had said thank you whenever they did anything in the house. See, I mean, they felt totally...
Yes, I think that's probably true, Rhonda.
Treated with total ingratitude for what they were doing in the house. And then they'd say, I'm going to go get a job and at least I'll have more good things in life, kind of thing. So there's all that.
Yeah. Well, so in your book, for each kind of suffering, you take several saints, but one saint in particular whose life exemplified this kind of suffering. And so tell us about the life of Saint Praxedis, or actually she's not canonized yet, is she? But Praxedis, and how she found peace in the midst of exploitation.
Yeah, this is a fascinating story because even though she's 19th century primarily, she goes she's into the 20th century, but early 20th century. She's a woman saint whose life people can identify with in certain ways. And so she was a Spanish woman in Spain, not Hispanic, American Hispanic, in Spain. And her name is pronounced Praxedis. And she's born in 1886. And the family were mining engineers. She was one of 12 children, 5 of whom died in childhood. And she was a very pious girl, and her whole family was into the Mass, the Rosary, helping the poor. And she especially loved to help the poor and to pray the Rosary, and she was always very obedient and this kind of thing. And she really wanted to become a religious sister, but the family didn't want her to do that. And she finally got married, and this at quite old for those days. She was 28 when she got married. And she fell in love with a poorer man, but she thought he was worthy because of the goodness she saw in him. And they had a few rooms, and meanwhile her own family had become rather well-to-do. Okay, so now this man she marries, Gabriel, has a very bad temper, and after their marriage he becomes abusive. For instance, he slapped her when she was pregnant with their first child. He was very impatient. He was especially impatient because of the length of religious services which he went to. But then, she would want to come early, stay late, that kind of thing.
Yes.
So now it was very common in those days in Spain is the men would spend the evening at the bar and so forth in the evening. Yeah. And so he would have flare-ups and he would repent. And finally, Praxedis told her father about this. And then her uncle said, tell your mother-in-law. The mother-in-law was a strong figure. And apparently the mother-in-law berated her son so sharply that he completely reformed, and then their marriage was never troubled by his temper thereafter. And he stopped going to the bar, and he stopped wasting money on on dinners with his friends. Okay, so anyhow, so she's going to daily mass. She loves Jesus. She has these four boys. And her husband dies in a train accident just after the birth of their fourth child. Now, here's where exploitation comes in, is the following. They didn't have any money. And so she talks to the family members, and she was supposed to have received an inheritance from her father before he died, but he didn't write this down. Mm-hmm. And Praxedis' mother, the grandmother of these kids, she said, come into my house instead, live with me, and she'd be living in the house of her mother, which was a big house, also with her unmarried sister, Florentina. But she was there, she could have a room and she could have food, and she began to help in the house more and more. Now, here was the problem. The sister, who was a teacher actually, even though she was a school teacher, she didn't like little babies, little kids. And she hated having these four kids around and all the noise they made. And also, she didn't like housework. And so Praxedis became the servant of the family, a sort of Cinderella. Mm-hmm. And the servant who had been there didn't like having the four kids around either, and that servant left. And Praxedis said there was no need to get another maid because she could take care of everything now. Mm-hmm. So, in effect, she was compliant with being exploited in a certain way, but this is because she had these huge supernatural motives for this.
Yes.
Okay. So she would bring breakfast to her mother and sister in bed. Then she would serve them other meals at the table, never asking her sister to help her. And she had to make clothing for her sons out of her father's old garments that were in the attic. And when I was trying to figure this out in terms of this chapter on being exploited, that why did, it doesn't say in the book about her why exactly she did this, but it seemed as if that since she chose to marry a poor man against the wishes of her parents and was therefore a penniless widow, that she thought she had no right to be treated like a wealthy woman with servants of her own. Another possibility is that she was a woman of great physical energy and she liked to work. And so she was working in the house where the kids were, and maybe she preferred to work. You know, there are people who complain, women who complain about overwork in the house, who nonetheless can't stand to sit still and have no big interest, that they would rather be doing something else, and who work very hard in the house. As sort of part of their nature to do so. But I think really it was her love for interior prayer that while she was doing housework, she could pray interiorly. Mm-hmm. And I think she had a kind of interior contemplative prayer even while she was doing all this housework. Mm-hmm. And that she preferred the company of the Lord to long meals with her relatives. See? So this is, for instance, you know, see, when we think of contemplative prayer, we're thinking of people, contemplative nuns in trances. That's our usual example that we have in our imaginations. But it's just as much contemplative prayer to be in the presence of Jesus all day long while you're doing different kind of work. See? At least that's the way
that's what Brother Lawrence talked about. Yeah.
Yeah, right, but maybe some of our listeners don't know about Brother Lawrence.
Practicing well, that's all right. Practicing the Presence of God, his book. Anyway.
Yeah, why don't you just summarize that quickly, because maybe that's more important than anything else we say.
No, I don't think so. I just was giving saying that some people may be aware of it. It's finding God in the pots and pans. That there's a kind of contemplative prayer where you feel God's presence, or whether you feel Him or not, you're praying, no matter what you're doing.
What makes it contemplative rather than verbal is it's not typically that you're saying long prayers out of a prayer book, which you couldn't do while you're washing dishes unless you have all the prayers tacked up to the fridge. Some women do that, by the way. But it's more that you avert to His presence, that you remember that He is present all day long. He reminds you of His presence. And according to many spiritual writers who I have read and studied, this is a very high form of prayer, just to always try to be aware that Jesus wants to be with us in our daily life. And
that's Rhonda, how much of this prayer is a supernatural gift, a grace, and how much of it is something we can will?
Well, it always has to be both ways, because love is a back and forth between two hearts. So it's not that God is going to zap us and then automatically we start noticing His presence. There has to be a flow of love back and forth. We have to want such a thing. Now you could say, well, anyway, everyone would want to be aware of the presence of Jesus even though we can't see Him. So someone could say that, but I don't think that's really true, because I think there's a part of us that wants to be independent and not to be focused on Jesus at all, but just to be focused on doing our own thing our own way.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But I do think, but as you said, I just want our listeners to know that, yes, you can make what they call ejaculatory prayers. You can talk to Jesus throughout the day and so on, but the kind of prayer Rhonda's talking about is advanced, and a gift is involved. So don't make yourself feel like you have to be doing this, doing what Rhonda's talking about here until you get to that stage in your prayer life. So anyway, Rhonda.
I would say, I don't know, I guess I would put it a little differently. I would say when we read about some form of prayer that somebody else did, for instance, a saint did, and we don't pray that way, that we ought to say, Jesus, if you want me to pray that way, show me how, or give me that gift. It's
yeah. Well, you can't give yourself the gift of contemplative prayer. You can do things to receive it. You can prepare yourself to receive it.
Yeah, I guess let's take an analogy to a little kid. The mother would like the kid to, when the kid passes by, to say, "Hi, Mom," or "I love you, Mom." Okay, She doesn't insist that the kid do this. But when she says, "Hello, sweetie," as the kid passes by, if the kid is willing, the kid is going to start saying something back. Maybe not. It's not, I don't know, I don't want to make it seem too much. You either have the grace or you don't have the grace. If you don't have the grace, don't worry. Or something.
Well, if you're talking about, Rhonda, if you're talking about the contemplative prayer, then you do kind of have to have the grace. If you're talking about just lifting your heart and mind to God throughout the day, yes, we can all do that. And it would be a good thing if we did that.
Yes, I think that leads in. Well, it depends. Here we go. It depends how we define contemplative prayer. You could define contemplative prayer in such a way that it's so much only a gift from God that there's that it isn't a back and forth.
That's how I'm talking about mystical prayer.
Oh,
when I talk about contemplation, I'm talking about prayer in the illuminative way.
Oh, okay. So now I'm thinking of contemplative prayer in contrast to meditative and verbal prayer, rather. So that's a different contrast. So, for instance, I mean, the way I studied it, so was that, I guess I'm getting this from Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, though, is, okay, you have verbal prayer when you say, for instance, Hail Mary, or the Our Father prayer. That's a verbal prayer. And you have meditative prayer where you think about the mysteries of God's life and you think about things. And then your contemplative prayer is much more wordless and much more a flow of grace, of course, started by God, but it's not necessarily an infused grace of the unitive way.
Infused prayer in an earlier stage, Rhonda. You don't have to be in the unitive way to have infused prayer.
But you could be sitting in, for instance, adoration, which is very popular now. I would say there are plenty of people who are experiencing contemplative prayer in adoration chapels who are not in the unitive way.
No, listen, there are 3 stages in the spiritual journey, and the second stage is called the illuminative way, and you begin to get infused prayer. Infused prayer is prayer that is poured in, as it were. You know, it involves less work on your part. And that is infused. That's a mystical grace, and it's you begin to get that when you go after the dark night of the senses, when you enter the illuminative way. So you and I are using the word contemplative prayer somewhat differently.
That's what I think. But
we were talking about Praxedis and her prayer, and so why don't we get back, and how she was experiencing probably a very high degree of infused prayer as she was doing her housework. But as the rest of us are doing our housework, it would be a very good thing to be saying Hail Marys or talking to Jesus a little bit, and it doesn't have to be constant. But if you did it, I don't know, once an hour or something, that would be fantastic, right?
Right, because you're relating to the God who you love. In any case, what happened to her? And
it will prepare you for this other kind of prayer that we're talking about, where it happens a little bit more, with a little bit less effort on your part. Anyway, okay, Rhonda, sorry.
Okay, so he is Praxedis, and now her children are older, and she's going to 3 masses a day, and she sometimes sees Jesus visibly in the Eucharistic host. And then when there's the sort of big proof of her holiness is in the Spanish Civil War, there was right in her city, there were people who were Catholics, there were people who were anti-Catholic communists, but during the war she would help everyone. She would bring food to everyone, whether they were Catholics or communists. And with some of the communist atheists used to say that if all Christians were like Praxedis, they would believe. So
it's very beautiful part of the story. Yeah, that everybody loved her in this time of tremendous hatred and division. Yeah.
So a thing would be, well, how did she, So through this type of prayer of union with Jesus, she could put up with being exploited she was exploited by the family. That's not made up. I mean, people were horrified who would visit. She's the daughter. She's not the maid. What are you doing? You know?
Yes.
But she did this out of her prayer life, out of her love for Jesus. I have for each chapter quotations from the Bible, and these are from Corinthians. And St. Paul says, "For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a slave of all, that I might win the more." Then he says, "He who was free when called is a slave of Christ." Now this is a time when there was, real slavery, legal slavery, right?
Yes.
So
people had an idea of what it meant to be a slave.
So instead of, when at the end of each chapter I talk about, well, what are these examples? I'll give you a few others. But what are these examples of suffering? How did they meet Christ, and how that we could follow? And it would start with a generous willingness to help versus a grudging, lazy, egocentric approach to others. So if my general attitude is, how can I do the least annoying work today, versus who can I help today in the family, at work, all over. And I'm sure all of you have met people who are like this. In a work situation, for instance, there are people who are just always looking to help. And they don't view every little thing as exploitation. Mm-hmm. I have an example right now in my life, which is very challenging to me. I'm very old now. I'm 80 years old, and I'm retired. And I just moved to this area where I have friends from way back, because I used to teach here in this area. And I had little groups, and in my little groups there were women who were mothers of teenage kids and so on and so forth. So when they were in school, they would come to this group and do spirituality with me and other different workshops, okay? Mm-hmm. So I come back now after 15 years, and one of these women is an old friend of mine from those groups. And she has empty nest. She has no kids at home anymore. Her husband's working all day. And so I said, could I hire you to drive me to the supermarket once a week? Because I don't drive anymore. And she said, I would be happy to take you to the supermarket, but you can't possibly pay me. I'm your friend. Mm-hmm. So now this is 5 months I've been here, and she takes me every week to the store and helps me find bargains and so on and so forth. And she does this just perfectly. She just loves doing this for me. And I keep saying, well, I don't want you to feel exploited. I'll take you out to lunch first. Here, buy anything you want in the store. And I every week I say, I don't want you to feel exploited. And she looks at me with this look. Why would I feel exploited? And so finally I'm getting it.
That she wants to give you this gift. Yes.
That she doesn't view helping other people, she doesn't view it as exploitation at all. See?
Yes.
So it's because I would find it, because I'm very generous with spiritual and intellectual things and money, but I hate pesky little tasks, so I would feel exploitive if I was doing this, but she wouldn't. See?
Right.
Because basically she loves to help people, and every Christian should love to help people. Okay, accepting work as coming from God rather than as outrageous demands. So in all my reading, I've been writing books about the saints and reading the saints for a good 45 years. And I've never seen a saint who was doing things that were hard and that I would consider that they were exploited. I've never seen them thinking they were exploited, and they always say, because I'm doing it for Jesus. Mm-hmm. So they're not doing it just to people please, see?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
They're doing this out of a deep desire to, Jesus died for my sins, Jesus came down to open heaven to me, and I want to prepare for union with him in heaven by having a heart full of love for my neighbor, see? So they don't think in terms of, is this person exploiting me, see? So that's how I see the saints, our heroes, the saints, helping us. It's not that, in fact, we should just say it's good for people to exploit other people. Of course not. I mean, the person who's exploiting someone is unjust and is not doing the right thing, but it's the question of what is our own attitude toward
what is our response. You know, of course, in this, it also makes me think of the Serenity Prayer from the 12-step programs. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So if we're in a situation that we cannot change, you know, let's say you're in a concentration camp, you know, or you're living in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, you know. If you're in a situation where you're being exploited and there's nothing you can do about it, then this would be the good response, right? A surrender to God's will and trying to serve Christ in the midst of all of this.
Yes, it shouldn't be just because you shouldn't just give in normal situations just because you're too weak to ask for justice. You should decide, well, this is unjust, but since I don't have a good way to get around this unjust situation, I should do everything out of love.
And of course, we want to make a distinction here, obviously. If you're in a situation where somebody is seriously abusive, physically or emotionally, constantly, and is posing the possibility of grave harm to you or your children, in that case, you would want to discern whether or not you need to leave. We're not saying you should stay in a gravely, in a seriously abusive situation. And there are probably cases that are kind of gray, where it's not so clear what to do. But Praxedes was not in that situation with her mother and sister. There was no, and when danger, emotional or physical danger to her or her children. When her aunt, remember you said that when the sister was too critical of her children, Praxedes would step in and protect them.
So that's different. That's a different kind of situation. So
right, we're talking. So in other words, we're not saying if you have a husband who beats you that you should stay. I mean, we don't know if you should go or stay. I mean, you have to discern that. But
Now, in canon law, it happens when we were talking. Mary and I were talking about this program beforehand this week. And Mary looked up canon law on this question of separation in the case of abuse. And the distinction that's made, which seems to me pretty important, is whether this is a usual pattern or something very occasional. Yes. So occasionally, many people who are angry, if you press their buttons or my buttons, I will get very enraged, but it's not as if this is my daily way of being. See, that's a very different thing if the daily pattern of relationship is rage and battering.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, but, what was beautiful, I thought, about Praxedes is that she lived the words literally that Jesus said to the apostles, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. And oftentimes when the saints take the words of Scripture literally, great things happen. Don't they? I mean, St. Francis took the words of Jesus to the apostles to go out and preach, to travel and preach with no money, no extra shirt, no walking stick, no bag, and St. Francis of Assisi took those words literally, and he, reformed the church in the Middle Ages.
Yes, absolutely.
Helped to rebuild the church. So Praxedes, I'm not saying those were the words necessarily that motivated her, but that's what she did. If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all.
Well, let's look at another example here of a saint that's even more extreme. And I didn't know about her until I was doing this research. And that's Saint Saint-Germain de Pibrac. She was a French saint of the 16th century. And listen to this. Her mother died when she was a small child, and her father remarried, and the stepmother took an extreme dislike to Germain, partly because she had a withered hand that she had been born with, and in a poor family, such a birth defect was a liability for housework and heavy farming. We who live, many of us who are listening to this program, who live in cities, we don't really understand that in previous times, farm life was, you starved if you didn't have enough kids to till the fields, kind of thing. We're very removed from that kind of setup. Anyhow, so she was banished to the stable, and she's sleeping on straw and in rags, and she only gets to eat table scraps. So her stepmother would relate to Germain with sarcasm, ridicule, and beatings. And this little girl turns this whole Cinderella life by prayer, and all she has in her of possessions is a cross made of 2 sticks and a rosary made with knotted pieces of string. And she never learned to read or write. But miracles began to flow from her, prayers. And villagers would hear beautiful music, miraculous music coming from the barn when she was sleeping. Inside, they saw the girl surrounded by light in a trance of rapture. Okay. Now, all day long, she's tending the sheep. And we think of this as, oh, isn't that sweet? We have a nice little picture of a girl shepherdess, right?
Yes.
So there were wolves in the area, so she was in danger of being eaten by wolves.
Oh, gosh.
So it wasn't that idyllic, okay?
Right.
And she was devoted to the Mass, and so she would leave the sheep with her guardian angel while she went to Mass. Once there was a storm and the river overflowed, and she couldn't go to church. The villagers were astonished to see the river parted in 2, and the little saint walked across the river. So, okay, so here she is, changing these horrible, horrible situations. God is changing it for her into a source of holiness. And so she would teach the little children, and she'd teach the beggars. And so there was a miracle that happened that her stepmother had to see. So she collapsed on the ground when her stepmother was beating her, and her apron opened, revealing spring flowers, even though it was winter. So, sort of like Our Lady of Guadalupe and the Kilma. And it was this miracle that converted this stepmother, and she repented of all her cruelty and invited her to come back to live in the house. But Germaine preferred to live in the stable because that was where she prayed. So, oh my God, what a story of exploitation. I mean,
yes.
Good grief.
And by growing in love for Christ, by accepting all of this, she won the grace to convert her stepmother and probably the villagers, no doubt. Didn't she?
Yes. So when I read these stories, it made me ashamed of being so grudging. And I was talking about this experience of feeling exploited in my house because my husband didn't want to do housework. Mm-hmm. And I have a beautiful story about this, how eventually I forgave him for all this. So it happened that at the end of the day, after watching TV with me sitting marking papers, he would always ask for a cup of tea and dessert. We would have tea and dessert afterwards. And I would be thinking, okay, even though he's sick, here I am all day working. Couldn't he bring me a cup of tea? Instead of, I have to now get up and do one more chore. See, and I would always do this, grinding my teeth with anger. And so one day I was at a huge healing mass, and the priest said, this is a charismatic healing mass, and the priest said, I want all the couples after the mass. I would like all the couples to stand up, hold each other's hands, and unconditionally forgive each other. Well, my husband hated that kind of prayer, and he wasn't there. So I just held on to my wedding ring and said the same prayer of unconditional forgiveness of everything in our whole marriage. And afterwards I came home and it was 9 o'clock, and my husband opened the door and he said, you look tired, Rhonda. Can I make you a cup of tea?
It's an incredible story.
And this is the beginning of our marriage getting much better. And afterwards, when I thought about why did this happen just at that moment, I thought because I had unconditionally forgiven him, because I got that grace at that healing service, the hate was out of my eyes and he could see the tiredness.
Mm-hmm.
See? So
Rhonda, that was a great grace. I mean, it's not so easy to forgive, is it?
Yeah, it was just a grace. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So
I mean, you had probably been praying for a long time for the grace, right? Knowing you, I would imagine that that's something you wanted.
Not exactly.
No.
No. I do.
Okay, it was an even greater grace because I know that forgiveness can be very hard in my own life. But
no, from years of I do all these Catholic anger management groups. I have a book called Taming the Lion Within 5 Steps from Anger to Peace, and basically people like being angry. We enjoy being angry, so we're not always praying to be able to forgive, especially with long, chronic things. Sure, big things in a relationship, of course I'm always praying to forgive, but chronic things that go on every day, I might be enjoying being, because when you're angry, you feel superior. You're putting someone else down. You're describing them sarcastically in your mind. or if we enjoy this out of pride. But this is a whole long subject which we can talk about some other time.
Yes, and we have a whole show on that on the same website. You can see Rhonda and I did a show about her book on overcoming anger. So Rhonda, you were telling us about what to do if we're in a position of being exploited. And you said, one thing you said was start with a generous willingness to help versus a grudging, lazy approach to others. And then you said accept work as coming from God rather than as outrageous demands. What are some of the other things that we can do in this situation?
Oh, one of them
that you mentioned in your book.
Okay, one of them is, by the way, if you want to find these old shows, what you do is when you're on WCAT radio, you go to the day that the show is on, and then you find the show, and then you click on this little blue link, and there you'll find all the old archived shows. Okay, and also you can come on the show when it's a live show. This one is recorded, but when it's a live show, you can come on and ask questions yourself. Okay, one of the other things that I suggest comes from a very simple thing that a spiritual director once told me. He was listening to me complaining about my life, and he said, don't use the word I can't, use the word I won't. Mm-hmm. And this is what he meant. Bottom line, we say, well, I have to do X, Y, Z. There's no way out. I have to do it. But if we really thought that, if we really wanted to get out of something, we could just leave the situation, even if it would be the wrong thing to do. So instead we should say, given that I wish to be a married woman, and given that it's certainly not a reason for annulling the marriage that you have personality conflicts, I could just say, hey, I'm not going to make tea anymore in the evening. If you want to make it for yourself, I could say that. Well, then you say, well, that wouldn't be very nice. So it's nicer to be grumbling every single night and grinding your teeth. So you have to face the idea, okay, for various reasons, I'm doing this thing, and if I'm doing it because I think it's the right thing, even though the other person is unjust, if I'm doing it for Jesus, then I ought to do it with a smile. Mm-hmm. Not with hate.
Mm-hmm. Right. That would help to grow in holiness, right? But it's not so simple, I know. You mentioned in your book confiding your troubles to a devout person.
Yeah, this is a very good thing. It's not good to confide your troubles to someone who's just going to say to you, oh, yeah, your husband or your kids or your mother, oh, yeah, they're horrible people, and let me tell you about the horrible people who are exploiting me. You should confide in someone who's holier than you are and who will give you good advice on how to deal with something.
Yes.
And that could be a pastoral counselor.
That's right.
It could be
sometimes try to be sure it's somebody who's wise, prudent, and holy. Yeah.
Well, it's the end of the show, and I enjoyed very much being on it. And maybe you could say a closing prayer, dear Mary.
Yes, Rhonda.
Thank you.
Okay. One other thing that Rhonda just mentioned in her book, she told a story of how a child once asked Praxedes how he was looking at a picture on a holy card of Jesus
embracing St. Francis from the cross. And he asked Praxedes how Jesus could lean down so far if the nails held him to the cross. And Praxedes replied that it was not so much the nails that held Jesus to the cross, but love. So Rhonda was saying that she would serve people with love, not because they demanded it of her as an obligation, like a nail, even though they did demand it, but for her own motive, which was love. Rhonda suggests that we devote ourselves to daily Mass and lying on the crosses of our life, not because the nails bind us, but because you love with Christ's love. And she does suggest talking to Christ throughout the day. So, thank you for joining us today. And hope you've enjoyed your time with us. And you've been listening to Rivers of Living Water, a show about how to grow in holiness and have an intimate relationship with God. We'll close with a prayer. Father, thank you for calling us into an intimate relationship with yourself. Please give us the grace to accept the crosses in our lives, the ones that we can do nothing about, and help us to embrace your will and find joy in that, so that we may enter into more intimate relationship with you and help you save souls. And we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.